Hello and welcome to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, back after the weekend to talk with you guys about the NFL and just football in general. Some more storylines that happened over this past weekend that I wanted to talk to you guys about today and discuss some things I also saw with some recent comments as well. Today I wanted to talk about the biggest news probably that happened in the NFL, the salary cap estimated amount, or not estimated amount, set amount for the salary cap numbers this coming year is set around $255.4 million, a big increase from last year, and I wanted to break some of the numbers down more from that and talk to you guys about that. I wanted to bring you a free agency update on some of the moves that have started to happen over this past weekend and how it could impact some things, what I thought of those moves, and just going forward, potentially we could project some other moves that could happen as a result from the first dominoes to fall already. Later in the show, I wanted to bring up Sam Howell and his situation, not only with the Commanders. There's a lot of new moving pieces coming in with the Commanders, and Sam Howell might be the odd one left out because of it. And there does seem to be a lot of trade interest in Sam Howell. And that being said, that could just generate some new interesting dynamics that could happen afterwards with what the Commanders could do with their pick or just trading out of it. I'll talk more about that in the second half of the show. And lastly, some comments that A.J. Brown made in the media recently, actually on a local radio station in Philadelphia recently, about just, again, reassuring everyone in Philadelphia that he wants to stay, he wants to be there, and after the rumors that potentially he could have wanted to leave after a rough season last year, but he reassured everybody that he wanted to stay. And on top of that, I wanted to take those comments and just take it a step further and potentially incline at a issue that I kind of see with the Eagles, not currently, but that could generate going forward with the recent flare-ups and the incidents on the sideline, all that and more coming up in the show. But before I jump into the first segment, I wanted to please remind you guys to use the tip and donations link that you'll see running across the ticker down below me with any question that you may have that you might want to pop into the chat at any point during this live stream. We usually get a good amount of engagement and questions during these shows. So to make sure I'm able to read your question on air and I'm able to see it in the chat pop up at the top of the list, please use the tip and donations link running across the ticker below me. That's streamelements.com/GSMC Sports Network./tip. Again, the link is streamelements.com/GSMC Sports Network./tip. It's a big help for not only this show, but for all the shows along the network, and it's greatly appreciated every time you guys have a question to use that link and engage with the show. But that being said, I can jump into the first story, the chip shot story of every show that I like to start off with. The biggest news today, and just going on in this offseason for the NFL, the salary cap number was set at $255.4. Like I mentioned, it's a $30 million increase from the last year's salary cap that was set around $225 million. It gets another big jump, plus an additional $74 million per club for each of their player benefits. So you're looking at around a total of over or almost $330 million in total player costs for 2024. And it's more than $10.5 billion league-wide. And I know I just threw out a lot of numbers, but it all is important in just the general sense that it's big for those players, for these teams that are very binded by the salary cap numbers. A lot of them are in big deficits, just that I will get into later in the show, are the Saints, the Dolphins are in a deficit, and other teams like the Minnesota Vikings have to potentially put into their long-term plan that, a guy like Justin Jefferson, an all-world player, arguably a top 3 receiver in the league, is going to want his money eventually. He's not a free agent this offseason, but that is coming up, I believe, next offseason. And I've talked about it on this show before. He has said, or reports have said, that he's wanted to reset the wide receiver market for a while now, just based on the numbers and all the records that he's broken. I don't see the Vikings having a problem paying him and keeping him around as long as possible. So the market right now for receivers is set at $30 million, with Tyreek getting that the most latest receiver to get that number. So just all of that combined in, it really helps those teams out, really just to, set their future plans more in order, get everything under wraps. Obviously, it starts with this offseason, but that is a big part of it going forward. Another thing that plays into the salary cap being so high, just continually to show this exponential growth year in and year out, is because of all the new media deals, the TV deals that have just continued to grow in a crazy way ever since, the expansion of the regular season, the new modifications to the playoffs, and these huge new deals you get with Amazon Prime, streaming networks like Peacock as well. All this money, just, it seems like a lot, and it might seem to more, regular fans, just the general fan in general that, why is this all happening and why is all this moving on to streaming platforms? It all comes back to the salary cap and increasing it, and it only helps to benefit probably the owners a lot, but these teams that have these big numbers and that they need these funds to come in to function for as an organization, to get all their numbers in check and produce a good competitive team next year in and year out. And all this just plays a part in that. Something that I thought was pretty interesting that I found out while researching, all the numbers behind it, was that after 2012, the salary cap started growing by $10 million at a steady rate for a few years after that, and then it actually went down $10 million from 2020 to 2021 because of the COVID year in 2019. There was a lot of, just players that deferred, a lot of clubs in general too that deferred their money in that year, and it actually didn't take it into account until 2 years after 2019, and it went down that year. And that's why now it all plays back into it, why you see such a huge influx now of $30 million, a huge jump in money with $30 million now coming in instead of that steady $10 million that was shown from 2012. All of that played into account because of COVID, because of how strange everything was. A lot of changes were made during that year, obviously, and teams had to pay for that, unfortunately, but now they kind of get a reimbursement in a way with this sort of influx of money. And now, if you want to look forward and project even more, I mentioned just the salary cap, the free agents that teams have to get in order now with March just on the horizon. Really, just we're actually in the last week of February, so March is just really right around the corner. Teams have until 4 p.m. Eastern Time on March 13th specifically, when the new year officially starts, to get that salary cap number under control, or each team to get the number that they're at right now under the salary cap before free agency begins. And on top of that, I mentioned a lot of those teams are in a bind right now, specifically the Saints, which I'll talk about. They need to get their, I'm going to talk about it later, but just right now, I think they're $74 million into the salary cap debt. So they're going to have to do a lot of moving, a lot of restructuring deals to kind of get under that before the new year starts in the NFL. And with all this news coming out about the salary cap numbers and, what these guys eventually are going to get paid, the league also set out their designated numbers for the franchise tag for the non-exclusive, the exclusive, and the transitional tags as well, kind of alluding to what I'm going to talk about later. But some of those tags were pretty low, in my opinion, for some of the positions that I can just think of off the top of my head. The transitional tag for running backs is single digits this year. It's going to be 9.7 around there, just in that ballpark. Some running backs that are available for this are Najee Harris. He's not an unrestricted free agent this year, but going forward, if the Steelers were to do something with him, it would be at a 9.5, 9.7 around-ish amount. Just today, you saw with a lot of running backs not getting designated to receive that franchise tag. You saw Josh Jacobs, that his tag amount was set to be almost $15 million or 14 and some change after that. And that's obviously a high number for running backs, but because that is an exclusive tag, it will be a lot, and they get that set amount from the top, I want to say the top 5 most recent paid players at that position. I could be wrong on that. It's something like that. It's the top 5 most recent or the top 10 in general in the position. I was looking it up before this, but I can't remember now. And his, obviously, paying him 14.5 would be way too much for a running back based on the market nowadays. So he's not going to get tagged. Same with Saquon and Derrick Henry, Tony Pollard, Austin Eckler were all designated today to not get that franchise tag. They still could sign with their teams, but they're not. They won't be put into that restrictive franchise tag. So they do have options to go to other teams, but that is still yet to be seen. Overall, that's really what the salary cap is set at now and what every team's kind of looking at to kind of work with and get their numbers in check before the new league year starts on March 13th for the NFL. That day is coming soon, like I mentioned, and some teams I wanted to talk about next were going to be the Dolphins, the Saints, the Bengals in some aspect, and some other teams that just made some more recent free agency moves to start off free agency in just this period of everything's starting to get into a whirlwind now. The NFL Combine is just a few days away, technically, with all the drills starting. And that'll be the next topic I get into after the break. A little free agency update about who's moved where, who's staying, and what that can mean for some of these teams. But I'll send it to a quick break right now, and it'll be more free agency talk, franchise tag players, and some significant players being cut, all that right after this.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to talk about more free agency, more moves that have started to fall with some of these teams in the NFL. The first player that was officially franchise tagged this offseason, and some restructuring going on around a majority of these teams, so most of all, this one team in particular. Starting it all off, like I mentioned, with the Miami Dolphins. Some pretty big moves made by them. The first move, I think, was made by them officially. The first player to be released. First of all, they're $56.7 million in a cap deficit, so they're gonna be one of the more frequent teams to restructure, cut players that might surprise a lot of people, but they have to, of course, get under that salary cap number. The first player that they released was their starting linebacker, Emmanuel Ogbah. Now, if you remember, Emmanuel Ogbah was actually signed to a pretty hefty deal for a player like him, a linebacker, outside linebacker, pass rusher, whatever you want to call it. Signed in 2020, 2021. He signed a 4-year deal, $65 million in that deal itself. He had a very impressive campaign, like I mentioned, in 2020, 2021. Then after that, it kind of started becoming a little bit rougher for Emmanuel Ogbah. He wasn't as dominant, or you wouldn't see him have the kind of performances that he had before he had that contract. And regardless of what you want to say, did he deserve it? Was it just him playing better to get that contract and then, kind of dying off after that? He did struggle with some injuries as well and never really got back to that same explosiveness, same kind of player that he was before the deal. But, that sort of contract, for the limited amount of production that you're getting from Ogbah, it didn't make sense for the Dolphins to keep him around, especially with the elevation and just bursting onto the scene from their outside linebackers. Now they got Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips as well. Now both of them are coming off a very, very tough injuries this past season. Like I mentioned, Phillips, he ruptured his Achilles, and I'm pretty sure Bradley Chubb either towards ACL or had an Achilles, one of those really severe injuries as well. So those two guys are very important for their teams. Pass rushers like that don't just come around, but coming off those injuries are really tough for any pass rusher to come back from. And it's going to be interesting how they recover from that, because it did happen towards the end of the year, so that window of recovering isn't as long as if it happened at the start. But regardless, I think the Dolphins just felt that regardless of the injury, Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb are still relatively young compared to Emmanuel Ogbah. So just taking that all into account and, seeing the number and the kind of contract Ogbah was getting, it made sense to cut him. They actually saved $13.7 million on the cap. $4 million of that is dead money. But by releasing him, they at least save that and get that deficit to fall a little bit more. Staying on the Dolphins, Xavier Howard, probably one of the biggest players released so far this offseason. One of their two best corners in not only the league in terms of duo-wise, but on the team itself. They just signed Jalen Ramsey. They had Xavier Howard on the team already, but he, again, was one of these cap casualties that kind of had to go in a sense because of the huge amount of money he was getting paid. And he led the league in interceptions that one year, that crazy year that he had, where he had just tons of interceptions. But after that season, it wasn't that he couldn't live up to that again, but that season was so far beyond just what regular production looks like you expect from a corner. It was outstanding what he did. I think he was definitely in conversation for Defensive Player of the Year. But to replicate that and produce close to that, he never really got back up to that. Not even that close as well, because he was dealing with injuries, and it just never seemed to fall back all into place for Xavier Howard. They kind of got Jalen Ramsey to kind of cover for that a little bit. It's great when both of them play. They have a great duo when both of them play, but if you only have Xavier Howard, the corners that they have at that position aren't particularly great. So you kind of see why they got Jalen Ramsey, bringing him in. You kind of always almost have at least one corner that's an all-world corner, a top 10 corner that you can stick in there and be comfortable that he's going to do his best and limit the opposing team's wide receiver one. And now, with that assurance that you have in Ramsey, this move was almost a no-brainer. It saves the Miami Dolphins almost $19 million in cap space by designating him to be a post-June 1st release. All that means is that his salary cap number, the number that the Dolphins have to carry, is only valid until June, and then after June, it'll be officially off their books, off their salary cap. They could technically, and most likely will, release him and cut him from the team in March or April, but it'll still carry over that cap number through June, or at least until after June 1st, and then it'll be officially off. If they did it now and took that number off of the books now, they were only going to save almost barely $3 million if they did it before June 1st. So really no decision to be made there. There's only one thing you could do there. Howard gets off the books, and now Miami can get out of that deficit a little bit and focus on those other starters like I mentioned. Alex Van Ginkel, Robert Hunt, Isaiah Wynn, all these other guys that, could be valued a little bit more. Plus, if you look even further than that, into next offseason, will you pay Tua? Depending on the season that he has, all that extra money you could save up will make the decision later on for a quarterback decision like that a little bit easier if you kind of know where all your numbers are at. So those are the two biggest ones, in my opinion, for the Dolphins and that have happened so far. The next biggest move that kind of rivals that was T. Higgins. Over the weekend, it was reported that the Bengals let him know that he was going to get franchise tagged. It wasn't really made official until just today. They officially, I guess, documented it as T. Higgins going to be franchise tagged. That doesn't mean he can't get a long-term deal, but he only has until mid-July to get a long-term deal done, and then after that, it'll only be that one-year deal that he can play on. Similar to last year with Saquon and Josh Jacobs, it's a one-year deal, but they could also renegotiate that and get it to a different number. It doesn't have to be the 21, almost 22 million per year that it's expected to be on that non-exclusive tag amount of money. So, right now he is documented to get franchise tagged. They're definitely in the process of getting that thing done. The Bengals have said it numerous times that they would love to get a long-term deal done with T. Higgins just to keep him and Jamar Chase together, obviously, because their other wide receiver, Tyler Boyd, is most likely going to be lost in free agency. He's the other one that a lot of people tend to forget about, not really talk about, compared to T. Higgins, because T. Higgins is younger, bigger, perceived to be, the better receiver. I believe he is, but, that's up to anybody's opinion. And Tyler Boyd, he was still a good, reliable wide receiver, in my opinion. He's most likely going to end up on another team that I think would really benefit from his services still, because he's almost like a tight end, a slot receiver that you could rely upon a lot. I think he could be any quarterback's best friend, like I mentioned, like a tight end most often is. And obviously he is more agile, more fluid than a tight end, so it's going to be tougher for anybody to cover him in the middle of the field, and I think he's going to be a good signing elsewhere. I just don't see him staying with the Bengals if they're trying to work out a long-term deal with T. Higgins as well. And if they don't work out a long-term deal, then this process kind of shifts for the Bengals, because you would expect them to kind of go all in this year now with everything they got, really invest in whatever they need other than the wide receiver position, to go out and make sure that this year they're at least playing in the Super Bowl again. And then if they win it, that's great. The plan works completely as it should have. But if they know that they can't get a long-term deal done, and this is only going to be a 1 year short of rental for T. Higgins before he asks for the kind of money that they just can't pay, they have to make sure that this year it's the best that they've ever produced. And, they got to the Super Bowl. They lost to the Rams. But if they could get back there again and then win it, I would see it as a win for them. And I'm sure they would see it as a win if they were able to get a Super Bowl out of this talented group of receivers that they have. And then going forward, once you pay Jamar, obviously still have Joe Burrow, you could still, build a roster after that. But this is as good as it's going to get right now with T. Higgins, with Jamar, with Joe. This could be the last season with those three, and you have to make sure you maximize that to the best of your ability if and only if you can work out that long-term deal like I mentioned. Elsewhere in the league, there are just other flurries of moves being made. The Rams re-signed wide receiver Demarcus Robinson, just a one-year deal, $5 million for Robinson there. Had good production for the Rams in that wide receiver room that was very talented from the top with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua obviously jumping onto the scene. Demarcus Robinson in combination with Tutu Atwell kind of provided that support that those two elite wide receivers in Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua kind of garnished everybody else to, still shine in some way, but they're going to get the majority of the reception. So Demarcus Robinson stays in Los Angeles. Elsewhere, the Steelers released their starting center, Mason Cole. He was on a 3-year deal. He had started 34 games overall for the Pittsburgh Steelers. This move overall just clears about $5 million in cap space and gives them a little bit more flexibility, like I mentioned before, with the salary cap number for the entire league going up so much. Now that they're able to cut Mason Cole, they're able to have about $8 million or $7.5 million in available cap space to work with, and that's a big difference than it would have been before, where they actually would have been in a deficit. So this just helps them, get that relief a little bit, that they're at least in the positive now. Don't have to make any crazy moves, and other than that, they don't have any other major free agents to really worry about. Most of their playmakers and impactful players are going to be back under contract anyway, so that sort of move just kind of had to happen if and only if they were able to go out and maybe target a corner opposite of Joey Porter or a linebacker that are out there like a Levante David, Devin White, those kind of guys. If they felt they needed one, potentially sign a replacement center. I talked about on the YouTube Shorts the other day. Brian Allen's out there from the Los Angeles Rams. Connor Williams as well. They could do that, or they could just save it and use it in any other way that they feel right. But he was released just last week or a few days ago. That was one move, and the final move that I thought was pretty significant was from the Saints restructuring Derek Carr's current contract, to help that salary cap number, because the Saints recently, at least recently, have been known to work themselves out of these huge salary cap deficits that they find themselves in. This year they're almost $80 million into the cap deficit, which is crazy just to think about with all these contracts that they have. So they had to restructure Derek Carr's deal, and it's expected to save them about $23 million by converting some of that guaranteed money on some of his contract years to a signing bonus, and kind of working out of it that way instead of still giving him his money but just classifying it as something else, I guess, in a way. That's not all the work they're going to be doing. They're also expected to rework deals from some of their offensive linemen. Eric McCoy and Cesar Ruiz were the names mentioned in a lot of the reports that I read leading up to this episode. So expect the Saints to be very active within their own roster to restructure some deals and get something going. They still have a good amount of time. They have almost 2 weeks left, a little bit over that, to restructure these deals and get under that salary cap number. But like I mentioned, this has almost become sort of a trend with the Saints. The deals that they give out, restructuring them, getting under that salary cap number, it might hinder them from signing, some big name free agent to a lot of money. But they're still always able to remain competitive. They are getting up there in age with their roster, which could become a problem, but for now, they always seem to just get by and bring that number down and still be competitive in an NFC South division that, isn't the toughest, so they can get by, but with some moves that have been made, that could change, and then the Saints could be in trouble, but that's another conversation for another day. Like I said, they're able to restructure their quarterback's deal and get him down. And that was that for that segment. But on the topic of quarterbacks, another quarterback that has been in the news recently was Sam Howell. A lot is being made of what's going to happen to him if the Commanders, like they've been mocked, draft Jaden Daniels or Drake May. What's going to happen with Sam Howell? A lot of reports say that he does have some other teams interested in him. He didn't play that bad, in my opinion, this past season, and I think he could be of service somewhere else, I guess. I would say. Heck, he could even be a pretty good starter on another team, but more on that and more around the teams that are interested, what it could mean for the Commanders, some scenarios that the Commanders could consider. All that coming up on the other half of the show and on the other side of this break. So don't go anywhere. More quarterback talk around the Washington Commanders right up next.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, I'm still your host, Manny Maradiege, back to talk on the second half of the episode on Sam Howell, on the Washington Commanders. A very interesting scenario for the Commanders, just because they're not only in the top three, but because there's a lot of moving pieces to them. So that's a very interesting topic I wanted to get into. But before I do, again, one more time, I'd like to remind you guys to please, if you have any questions, anything to show any engagement with during this live episode, please make sure to use the tip and donations link down below on the ticker below me with any of those questions that you may have. The tip and donations link is streamelements.com/GSMC Sports Network./tip. Again, if you're unable to read it, just listening to this, it's streamelements.com/GSMC Sports Network./tip. It's a huge help for the network, this show, and everybody that's involved in this. It makes it easier for me to read your question on air if you have any. And just make sure to do that if you have any questions during the show or at any time during this. If you missed the last segment of the show, I talked about some free agency updates that I gave around T. Higgins getting franchise tagged, the Dolphins releasing two of their more well-known players because of salary cap issues, as well as Derek Carr restructuring his deal to get the Saints' huge salary cap deficit at least a little bit further down where they could manage it a little bit better. But now we can dive into Sam Howell and some trade rumors around him. If you're unaware what the Commanders' situation is currently, they have the second overall pick in the NFL draft this year, and the presumed first round or first overall pick is going to be Caleb Williams. But then you still have great quarterbacks like Jaden Daniels. Drake May's been highly touted as well among some circles. I've even heard guys like Tim Hasselbeck say he's the best quarterback in this draft in his opinion. And I've seen some other reporters like Merrill Hodge say he's very overrated. So if whichever of these teams takes it as the way they want, these are the presumed top three quarterbacks in the draft right now. Pretty much on everyone's board, I would imagine. And that sort of leaves the Commanders' current quarterback, Sam Howell, in a weird spot because there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of new vibes coming into the Washington Commanders. It's the first full offseason under owner Josh Harris. Cliff Kingsbury comes in as the new offensive coordinator, and Dan Quinn is obviously the new head coach. And they could go a plethora of different ways with this draft. I mentioned before, I've harped before, that I truly believe that the top 3 teams could get by at least this year. I know it's really hard to turn away from a Caleb Williams, a Jaden Daniels, a Drake May potentially. It's extremely hard and probably very unlikely that anybody ever does it, but these teams, especially the Commanders, need so much help elsewhere that one thing they could do is, trade out of it, like I've mentioned before. They need a lot of offensive lineman help, and there are some options that they could go. Not only in this draft, which has been deemed as a very deep offensive tackle class, and just offensive line in general class with some guys just off the top of my head, like Jackson Powers Johnson, a guy I'm very familiar with, Zach Frazier here in West Virginia, Mims, the offensive tackle from Georgia, Joe Alt from Notre Dame. There's a lot of guys that a lot of people, and in the Senior Bowl as well, some more players that kind of made a name for themselves have risen up draft boards. This class is extremely deep in that position. So, to me, there's so much that you could get back for the second overall pick, that you could address some of these areas and keep Sam Howell, because just off of the season that he had almost 4,000 passing yards, 21 touchdowns, and a league-high 21 interceptions. And that, obviously, the last number is going to jump out at anybody. 21 interceptions, that's ridiculous to throw that many. But a lot of people don't know that Sam Howell was the most sacked quarterback in the NFL this year. And I can almost guarantee and would bet that none of the offensive linemen that he had were very highly graded in any grading system, PFF or anything that ranks offensive linemen. I'm sure they were far from it, and he was still able to put up 4,000 passing yards and throw 21 touchdowns as well. Obviously, now he's heading into his 3rd year, I want to say, and he's going to be 23 years old, so he's still very young in terms of just age. He has that NFL experience, but I don't know. I just feel like if they could get him some protection, I've seen him play in a few games just in the division. One that jumps out was against the Eagles, where it was a back-and-forth game in a period of time where the Eagles were still very good. It was early on in the season. It was in Washington, but he went almost toe-to-toe with Jalen Hurts. The Eagles, that was the best part of the year for the Eagles. It's not like they were in the last 3 weeks where the Eagles were, just dropping games. This was a part where the Eagles were still a very good team, or started off very good. And Sam Howell and that overall team, their defense played great, and he went toe-to-toe almost with Jalen Hurts in that game. And I just don't think that just happens on accident. If he throws 21 touchdowns on the year, 4,000 passing yards with really Terry McLaurin as his only A1 receiver or anything close to that, I think it garnishes some consideration to really assessing what do we have here. Can we really move forward with this, at least for a year or two? If things go well with Dan Quinn, Cliff Kingsbury, and new owner Josh Harris, I think they really want to build something here with Dan Quinn. And, I think Sam Howell could be at least a good step in the right direction, not to gamble too much on one guy right away, and then it all really go bad for everybody if it doesn't pan out with the quarterback. Elsewhere with the Commanders, just in general, they have a lot of options as well in free agency. If you really want to go with a quarterback at 2, you're dead set on that. This is a Commanders team that has almost $74 million in cap space. It's the most in the league. And they have 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. So, that's the other side of it. If they want a quarterback, they have these other routes they could go to fill the voids on the rest of their team. Dan Quinn is a defensive-minded coach. He has led that Cowboys defense to a lot of success just these past years. And you might think or be inclined to think that he would want to shore up that defensive line, that just defensive side of the ball, to have some sort of resemblance that he kind of had in Dallas. And after the Commanders traded away Chase Young, Montez Sweat, you only really have De'Aaron Payne there. And then everybody else, they're solid, but they're not to the level that the Cowboys defense was by any stretch. So if you're Dan Quinn, if I'm looking at Dan Quinn, I'm thinking there's no way he can go this whole offseason, this whole draft without assessing that defense, at least with a couple picks, a couple offseason moves. They have the money and draft capital to do so. So if you look at it that way, okay, maybe drafting a quarterback isn't the worst at 2, but is it the guy you want at 2? That just brings up another scenario that I saw recently. Cliff Kingsbury and Caleb Williams' relationship. Cliff Kingsbury was there for a year, I want to say, with Caleb Williams at USC, or it might have been more than a year now that I'm thinking about it. But that relationship is there. It exists. There's some cohesion, at least, with Cliff Kingsbury, some relationship between him and Caleb Williams. And it was thrown out there that, they could be a team to move up for that number 1 pick. If the Bears were to trade out, keep Justin Fields, move only a spot back, they could get, they could draft Marvin Harrison if they wanted to, because he's on a lot of teams' draft boards that's high up. Obviously, the kind of career he had at Ohio State. The Bears could move back 1, get a receiver to help Justin Fields, and then number 1 could be Caleb Williams to the Commanders, and, that familiarity is there with Cliff Kingsbury and Caleb Williams. That's one option. Like I said before, they could trade back and have more of an option to get more offensive linemen on top of those 5 picks that they have in the first 3 rounds. If they were to trade back with, say, the Raiders. If they were to trade back with the Raiders, you know how much capital the Raiders would have to probably give the Commanders to go from 11 to 2, make that sort of jump. They would get a boatload of draft picks and just compensation for that. And the Raiders would be taking a big gamble, but the Commanders, I think, would be the clear winners in that trade if it were to happen. But these are all hypotheticals, and you guys could let me know what you guys think is the best option with all the information I just gave you. But that's kind of where the Commanders sit. Very interesting spot because, you can make a good case for both of them, but I'm still of the position that you could trade out of it, get a boatload of draft capital from the Raiders, the Vikings, anybody outside the top 10, even the Falcons at 8. It's just another team that comes to my mind if Justin Fields wasn't to move, and they are said to be very aggressive this offseason with a quarterback. Could be another team you can get a lot of compensation for that pick and trust them how, at least to get you over this rough period next season, to then really go all in next season with an established program and identity that you kind of want to figure out in this first year, see what works, see what doesn't work, and then you could go forward with a clear set of ideas if you're the Washington Commanders. Because I do think they're putting a lot in this new hiring of Josh Harris, bringing in Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury. I think a lot of people expect better things and, not gambling on one draft pick because you can, I think would benefit them a lot more. But that'll be it for that topic, the Commanders and everything. We're going to stay in the NFC East after this break and talk about A.J. Brown and the Eagles' potential underlying issue I see starting to develop a little bit. It's not there. I'm not saying they have this issue, but if it keeps trending this way, I think it'll become a lot bigger narrative next season if they're not winning games, if they're still struggling. So find out what I think that is and what A.J. Brown said on a local radio station after this break, up next. Back here for the final time on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. The Philadelphia Eagles, we remain in the NFC East with this team that had a lot of high hopes this past season. You know, after the season that they had, after the season Jalen Hurts had, a lot of people expected them to pick it up. I even thought they arguably could have had a better year than the Chiefs just at the start, before the season even started. I don't want people to think I'm crazy. But just at the beginning of the season, you saw basically the same squad coming back. Almost the same personnel. Obviously, the 2 coordinator losses were a lot more vital than a lot of people thought. But just off the thought, I thought same roster. They could only improve, at least I thought, from last year with the idea, the identity they wanted to prove. They went to the Super Bowl, and they learned that lesson, and I just thought that motivation to get back was going to be a little bit greater, a bit more of a driving force, but they obviously struggled there towards the end. They didn't have an awful season, and they just fell off, but I think they left a lot of people really desiring more after those games that they dropped, especially to the Cardinals, the Seahawks, the Giants. It wasn't pretty there towards the end, and a lot of it had to do with, like I mentioned, how bad they were playing. And once you don't get the results on the field, you start to see some things off the field, and a lot of times people zoomed in and ran with the idea of A.J. Brown having a conversation with Jalen Hurts on the sideline. Things starting to tense up a little bit on the sidelines with the defense. Some of the older guys like Fletcher Cox, Brandon Graham, on the O-line as well, you see some frustration, and then maybe even with Sirianni as well. And that kind of all led to people thinking that maybe A.J. Brown could start to think of not staying in Philadelphia, not sticking around, because he didn't see any improvement coming along. But A.J. Brown actually called into a local Philadelphia radio station, 94 WIP, during an afternoon show, to kind of clear up some things on their show last Friday, a couple days ago. Some of the quotes that he said that stood out to me were, the first thing he said was, "I have no problem. I want to be here. It's as simple as that. I love where I'm at. It's as simple as that. Next question." Made it pretty clear there. But then they went on with the conversation and kind of dug a little deeper into, the situation with Philadelphia, and his reactions to that was, "I'm the person you need on this team because I am willing to hold people accountable, make people around me better. But nobody sees that. All you see is the little flare-ups. Nobody in the building works harder than me." And I thought that was pretty interesting. Very direct quote from A.J. Brown, and I don't think he's wrong, really. I think him and Jalen Hurts are the two that come to mind where they're all about work. They're all about the team, selflessness, to the epitome of selflessness. Those two are to me. And it does get to a point where those two guys are the presumed leaders to some aspect for the offense. And when things don't start to go the way that they expected to, with all the talent that they had, the success that they had last year, it does boil up into some of those conversations that you saw last year on the sidelines. And a lot of people thought it was because A.J. Brown wasn't getting receptions. He was quick to dismiss that as well during the season. And then, he went on that crazy, outstanding streak where he had, I think, a row of 6 or 5 games where he had a bunch of receptions over like 100 yards and 2 touchdowns in each of those games or something crazy like that. And, it started to die down. And then when the struggles came up again, the story started to pop up again. And that's when you saw a lot of the attention get put on the coaches this time when it wasn't going right at the end of the season. A lot of it was put on Sirianni, the sort of juggling of coaches that you had from Brian Johnson to Matt Patricia to Sean Desai. It seemed like, at least how the media put it on TV that you read, that I saw, was, all of this switching and just mixing of the coaches. It really puts the players in a bad spot because they're not able to first get the communication in order, because if you're always just switching schemes and ideas and terms, there are so many terms in football. If you're always switching that with each coach that comes in, it's not going to work out. And once he went into the Eagles coaching, A.J. Brown also didn't like that, and he cleared it up as well on this show when he said the players wasn't executing. That's what it comes down to. I think the media kind of ran with the coaches. It was the players not executing. And it just goes on to that point, kind of hand in hand with the point I just made. How do you expect the players to execute if the system's is not there in place? Obviously, they didn't switch it up completely because Brian Johnson is basically running Nick Sirianni's offense. So offensively, yeah, there might be some tweaks in there, but it's not completely different, which was another issue that I can touch on in a second. But offensively, it wasn't the biggest issue. Just in terms of A.J. Brown saying that, the player's not executing, you can kind of see where he's coming from there if Brian Johnson is running Nick Sirianni's offense. But defensively, Sean Desai was moved up to the press box, or not the press box, but just up into the sky box to call it from there instead of on the sidelines. Then he was kind of demoted. Matt Patricia came in, and now he's calling the plays. And I find it hard to believe that Matt Patricia would run anything similar to Sean Desai, because it was Sean Desai's first, kick of being a defensive coordinator, and Matt Patricia's done it for years and years. He's been a head coach, so you can't tell me they didn't run 2 different things, because it's just hard to believe that Matt Patricia, with his experience, wouldn't bring in what he believes works for a defense. And that, I think, really derailed this season for the Eagles. Just defensively, it didn't look at all similar to what they were last year. They had some resemblance to the pass rush, but there wasn't those gaudy numbers that you saw from Hassan Reddick. Montez Sweat really not that much as well. Brandon Graham wasn't really getting there. Fletcher Cox wasn't getting there as much. Jalen Carter showed out as one of their rookies, but other than him, there wasn't much bright spots. And then you go further down or further up the defense, the secondary was, other than Darius Slay, everybody, it seemed, just fell off, or it just wasn't the same level. Particularly if I had to pick a player, it would be like James Bradbury. He was touted as being an all-world corner, at least to some resemblance to Darius Slay, but this year he was far from it. Then the linebackers weren't really there. Just throughout the whole season, they had Zach Cunningham, Darius Leonard at one point. Nakobe Dean was the starter, but then he kind of got hurt and never really came back in. It all was too many moving parts, too many switching of coaches, terminology, schemes, and stuff like that. The defense was what really suffered at the end of the day, and just I can't see how A.J. Brown obviously he plays offense. He doesn't really know too much of what's going on the defensive side of the ball. But defensively, it all just wasn't going for the Eagles. And, it kind of hints at an underlying issue that I kind of alluded to at the beginning of all of this before the break, that it's almost starting to become like a lack of maturity and a lack of somebody going in there and reassuring everything and being that voice of reason. There was a report that I know was talked about it on other shows on this network, that it was a report that Big Dom, the security guard for the Eagles, once he got suspended, a lot of reports were saying that affected Nick Sirianni a lot. He was kind of, as reported, was the voice of reason for Nick Sirianni. He kind of kept his emotions in check. And with him gone, it was also said that Sirianni got into some arguments with other coaches and, kind of lost his cool a little bit. And as a head coach, just in my opinion, if that were to be true, I find it hard to be, but if that was to be true, running a team, you can only imagine what the head coach has to do for that whole team. And if you're not focused, not locked in, and just your emotions aren't in check, you're almost rattled a little bit by some moments and don't know really how to handle it and don't know how to transmit that energy out to the players. You get sort of these situations where the tense arguments on the sideline, there's no calm voice of reason. It leads to bad decisions, bad communication. No one's on the same page. And then it just snowballs into what you kind of saw towards the end of the year with the Eagles. And I'm not saying that's there. I'm not in the locker room. I'm not there interviewing them. I can't really make that estimation. But just from the outside looking in, if all these reports were to be true, it just seems like nobody is taking control of, in those moments at least, being that voice of reason. Where if you look at other teams, if you look at the Chiefs, you can't tell me that when Steve Spagnuolo says something or when Andy Reid says something, he has everyone's attention. If you look at Andy Reid on the sideline, he always almost has the same expression. Nobody really loses their cool over there, at least not on the coaching side. Whereas with Sirianni, I think you've seen him. There's been some moments where just after games against the Chiefs, you see him kind of showboating, trash talking to an extent in some games, and that just doesn't. It's not the same thing you get with Andy Reid, and it kind of shows in the results that they get at times. But it's not a direct correlation, but that's the sort of thing that I'm kind of seeing with the Eagles, and these sort of issues boiling over to some extent and leading to bad results on the field. And they do have some questions to answer in the offseason in terms of, some of the coordinator positions, the personnel that they might have to re-sign or not re-sign, with some very loved veterans on the team and just among the city, and Kelsey, Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, all unrestricted free agents. They have a lot of things to iron out before they get back to the team we saw 2 years ago when they made it to the Super Bowl. But the way A.J. Brown talked, at least some Eagles fans, Eagles organization can have some rest knowing that, A.J. Brown seems to be really invested in this team and wants to make a change. But it really comes down to these other factors that a lot of people don't see, like he mentioned, to fall in line and, to get past all the little things, these little arguments, and just get back to producing on the field, which is what they were missing at the end of the day. And it just boiled over into the sidelines and just making the bad sort of news that you don't want to make, and just becoming a distraction more and more as the season went on. But again, I'm always interested to know what you guys think. Is that a trend you kind of start to see build with Sirianni and this Eagles team? Who do you think could be that next leader if Graham, Fletcher Cox, these guys were to leave? Who do you think would be the ideal next leader, that voice of reason in that Eagles locker room? If you guys show any engagement and stuff like that, let me know. I always would love to know what you guys think, especially with these last topics, trying to make it more of a discussion sort of topic. But with that being said, I have ran out of time for this episode. As always, I want to thank everyone for joining me today on this episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. As always, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your engagement, interaction always mean a lot to us, so please make sure to follow and like the channel and the show, as well as to subscribe and comment on other channels and other stuff like that you may see in the network. Follow us on the other social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, for more of this sort of content, sports content that you might like to see. There's also the other programs on the other sports network channel that you could engage with, and even different types of podcast genres on the podcast network channel as well, if you were to go check those out as well. And as always, if you like more of this football, NFL content, you could go over to the channel on the Sports Network channel or the Podcast Network channel, see all the individual segments if you weren't able to catch this entire show, or just YouTube shorts that are on there as well, that I always would love to see your guys' engagement with. But for now, I've been your host, Manny Moradiege. I'll be back again tomorrow, as am I, with every weekday this week and going forward, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, live, always here talking more NFL and more football in general. I've been your host, Manny Moradiege. Wishing you guys a good rest of your day, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.